It was January 10th, 1942. The Philippine jungle was dark and wet, and the night air smelled of cordite and blood. A battalion of battle-hardened Japanese infantry, veterans of the China campaigns, soldiers who had charged through enemy lines time and again, moved on the American positions near Bataan. They had done this before. They knew the rhythm of the bolt-action rifle: fire, pull back, chamber, fire. They knew the pauses. They knew how to exploit them. They had no idea what was waiting for them. The order came. The Japanese surged forward, and then the American line opened up, and it never seemed to stop. 8 rounds, 9, 10, 15. The volume of fire was unlike anything these men had ever encountered. One soldier fired, then another. The whole line was firing as fast as human hands could move a trigger. Not a machine gun, not a squad automatic weapon. Individual riflemen. The Japanese pressed on, and they died by the score. Lieutenant Colonel Philip Fry, commanding the 3rd Battalion, 57th Regiment, Philippine Scouts, the men holding that line, later tried to describe what happened. He gave up trying to find words equal to what he'd seen. "The Garand rifle," he said, "is beyond my descriptive powers. If you're watching this channel for the first time, welcome. We cover the real stories of real weapons in the hands of real soldiers, the history that changed the world." Hit subscribe and the bell notification so you don't miss what's coming next. Today we're going to follow the M1 Garand into the Pacific, and we're going to see it through the eyes of the soldiers who feared it, studied it, tried to copy it, and ultimately could not stop it. To understand what the M1 Garand meant to the Japanese, you first have to understand what they thought they were walking into. By December 1941, the Imperial Japanese Army was one of the most combat-experienced forces on the planet. They had been fighting in China since 1937, 4 years of brutal, grinding warfare against an enemy armed primarily with bolt-action rifles. In that environment, they had developed and refined a tactic that worked with devastating consistency: the massed infantry charge. The Japanese called it Totsugeki, the all-or-nothing assault, bayonets fixed, screaming at the enemy line, running full speed to close the distance before their opponent could reload. Against Chinese forces who were often poorly trained, poorly supplied, and equipped with slow-firing rifles, the tactic was terrifyingly effective. A man with a bolt-action rifle fires perhaps 15 aimed shots per minute. On a good day, in good conditions. Against a charging line of screaming infantry, that often wasn't enough. The Japanese military culture built around this reality. Speed, aggression, and spiritual will could overcome material disadvantage. The individual soldier's fighting spirit, Seishin, would triumph over the enemy's technology. They believed this deeply. They had reason to believe it. It had worked. Their intelligence on American infantry weapons was specific, and as of 1941, largely accurate. The standard American rifle was the M1 Springfield, a bolt-action rifle, 30 caliber, accurate and reliable, but slow. The Japanese field manuals accounted for it. Their doctrine was calibrated against it. They did not know about the Garand. John Cantius Garand was a French-Canadian engineer born in 1888 who had immigrated to the United States as a child. He had no military background. What he had was an engineer's obsession with how things worked and a stubborn belief that the bolt-action rifle, the weapon that had defined infantry combat since the 1860s, was fundamentally obsolete. A bolt-action rifle, no matter how finely made, required the shooter to move his hand off the trigger after every shot. Reach up, pull back the bolt. Chamber a new round, close the bolt, return to firing position, reacquire the target, and then pull the trigger again. That sequence took time. It broke the shooter's sight picture. It demanded practice to do quickly. And in the chaos of close-quarters combat, it was a liability. Garand began working on a semi-automatic alternative in the 1920s at Springfield Armory in Massachusetts. A semi-automatic rifle fires 1 round per trigger pull, automatically chambering the next round using the energy of the fired cartridge. The shooter never moves his hand off the trigger. He doesn't work a bolt. He fires, recovers, fires again as fast as his trigger finger moves. The concept was not new. But making a semi-automatic rifle that could survive the battlefield, the mud, the sand, the heat, the cold, the shock of being dropped and dragged and soaked in blood. That was the engineering challenge Garand spent over a decade solving. By 1932, he had his answer, the rifle that would be adopted as the M1. The U.S. Army officially adopted it in 1936. The Marine Corps followed by 1940. Garand, in a gesture that speaks volumes about the man's character, offered his invention to the government royalty-free. He never took a penny in licensing revenue from the more than 5 million M1 rifles eventually produced. He received a gold medal for meritorious service in 1941. The $100,000 congressional grant proposed in his honor never passed. The rifle became famous. John Garand remained until his death in 1974, largely unknown outside of firearms circles. The Army knew what they had. By the eve of Pearl Harbor, Springfield Armory had expanded to a workforce of 7,500 people, running 3 shifts around the clock. They were making rifles as fast as they could, but as fast as they were making them, there still weren't enough. Not yet. When Japan struck Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, December 8th in the Philippines, the M1 Garand was in the Pacific, but it was not everywhere. The Army's Philippine Department had received a significant resupply of M1s between August and November of 1941, mixing them in among the M1 903 Springfields already in service. The regular units, the 31st Infantry Regiment, the 45th and 57th Philippine Scouts, were equipped with Garands. But much of the force was still carrying the older bolt action. It was a transition still in progress when the Japanese struck. The ground fighting on Bataan began in earnest around the new year 1942. The American and Filipino forces, cut off from any realistic hope of reinforcement, fell back to the Bataan Peninsula and prepared to sell their lives as dearly as they could. They were badly outnumbered. They were running short of food, medicine, and ammunition. They would hold out for 4 months against an enemy that had just conquered most of Southeast Asia. And the men with M1 Garands were giving the Japanese something to think about. The logic of the firepower advantage was simple and brutal. A Japanese infantry squad typically carried Arisaka bolt-action rifles, the Type 38 primarily, chambered for a 6.5mm cartridge. Each man could manage, in disciplined fire, perhaps 12 to 15 rounds per minute. An American rifleman with an M1 Garand, trained to use the weapon effectively, could deliver 40 to 50 accurate rounds per minute at 300 yards. That is not a modest advantage. That is a different category of weapon. When an 8-man Japanese squad advanced on an American position, they were advancing on men who could sustain, individually, the same volume of fire as 2 or 3 Japanese riflemen combined. A single American infantry platoon with Garands had the small arms firepower that Japanese tactical doctrine had no established answer for. The reports filtering back through Japanese command were alarming. Their soldiers were encountering what they believed was an impossibility. American riflemen, standard infantry, apparently armed with machine guns. Individual soldiers in foxholes, behind sandbags, delivering sustained fire that cut down advancing troops before they could close to bayonet range. They weren't machine guns. They were M1 Garands in the hands of trained American riflemen. The reaction from the American side was equally striking, but in a different way. Even as Bataan was falling, even as it became clear that no reinforcements were coming and the peninsula would have to be surrendered, the soldiers and commanders who had used the M1 in combat were urgent in their praise. General Douglas MacArthur, who had staked his command in the Philippines and would soon be ordered to flee to Australia, found time in the middle of the collapse to cable the U.S. Ordnance Department about the rifle. Under combat conditions, MacArthur wrote, it operated with no mechanical defects and, when used in foxholes, did not develop stoppages from dust or dirt. It has been in almost constant action for as much as a week without cleaning or lubrication. A week without cleaning or lubrication, in a tropical jungle, in foxholes, against a determined and professional enemy. On February 23, 1942, 2 months after the fighting began, 6 weeks before the final surrender, the Washington Post ran a story headlined, "Bataan Proves Garand Worth." The New York Times ran its own piece, "Garand Rifle Praised by Jennifer MacArthur." That same week, Time magazine published "The Garand in Action." Even in defeat, even in the middle of one of the worst military disasters in American history, the rifle was proving itself. On February 24th, Major General Charles Wesson sent a telegram to the workers at the Winchester factory. Winchester was the only private sector manufacturer trusted by the government to produce the M1 during the war. The telegram relayed MacArthur's praise directly to the men and women on the assembly line. Soldiers were dying with their Garands, but they were making the enemy pay for every foot of ground. When Bataan finally surrendered on April 9, 1942, The surviving defenders reportedly destroyed their remaining M1 rifles rather than let them fall into Japanese hands. The photo record from those final days shows Garand armed riflemen still at their positions, still fighting until there was nothing left to fight for. Nearly 23,000 American troops and more than 100,000 Filipinos were killed or captured in the Philippines campaign. It was a catastrophe. But the Japanese had paid a price far greater than they had anticipated for a target they had expected to take in weeks. And the rifle had proven itself under the worst possible conditions. The Japanese captured some M1 Garands in the Philippines. They were professional soldiers and military engineers. They studied what they had captured, and what they found impressed and worried them in equal measure. The Imperial Japanese military had not been standing still on the question of semi-automatic rifles. In the 1930s, Japanese designers had experimented with self-loading infantry weapons, including versions based on the Czech ZH-29 rifle, which the Imperial Japanese Navy had evaluated. They had developed prototypes, the Type Hei, the Type Ko, the Type Otsu. None of them worked reliably enough. The programs had been canceled. Now they held the weapon that their enemies were using to break their charges, and they understood what it was. The problem was timing. Japan in 1942 was winning. The empire was at its greatest extent. The immediate pressure to redesign the basic infantry rifle was not there. The Arisaka was what the army had, what they had trained on, what the supply chain was built to support. There were 100 other priorities, but the awareness of the gap was present. Japanese officers had watched their men advance into fire volumes they hadn't been trained to handle. They had written their reports. The information existed in the Japanese military system. They did not act on it fast enough. The full meaning of the M1's advantage came into focus on August 21, 1942, at a jungle river on the northern coast of Guadalcanal. Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki commanded the first echelon of a Japanese unit that had been among the most decorated and battle-tested in the Pacific. His men had fought at Shanghai. They had fought at Guam. They were not green troops. They were by any measure formidable soldiers. Ichiki's force, approximately 800 men, had landed on Guadalcanal under orders to retake the airfield that American Marines had seized in August. His intelligence told him he was facing a demoralized garrison. His experience told him that a determined night assault could break any defensive line. He launched his attack after midnight. His men surged across the sandbar at the mouth of the Ilu River, misidentified as the Tenaru in early accounts, and the battle is still called the Battle of the Tenaru in most histories. Screaming, bayonets fixed, moving fast. The Marines were waiting. What followed was not a battle by traditional measures. It was a demonstration of what semi-automatic fire did to massed infantry tactics. The Marine line opened up, Garands, Browning automatic rifles, machine guns, and the Japanese were cut to pieces before they could close the distance. The men who made it through the initial fire were met by a counter-attacking Marine force that enveloped what remained of Ichiki's command. Of the 800 men Ichiki had landed, fewer than 100 survived. Colonel Ichiki burned his regimental colors and killed himself on the field. The official Marine casualty count, 34 dead. The ratio, nearly 800 Japanese dead for 34 Americans, was not an aberration. It was the new arithmetic of Pacific warfare when disciplined American riflemen with semi-automatic weapons met Japanese soldiers trained for a different kind of war. Japanese tactical doctrine, the Totsugeki charge that had shattered Chinese defensive lines again and again, was built on the assumption of an enemy who would slow down, lose their rate of fire, give the attackers a window. The M1 Garand closed that window. It wasn't completely closed. There were positions the Japanese overran, moments when courage and determination and sheer numbers succeeded. But the gap that the Banzai charge had exploited was being systematically shut. The Japanese high command drew the right conclusion. By late 1942, orders began circulating that units should avoid frontal assaults against prepared American positions. The Banzai charge would not disappear. Cultural, ideological, and logistical pressures would keep producing them until the last months of the war. But the men at the top knew the tactic was failing, and they knew, at least in part, why. The island-hopping campaign that defined the Pacific War from 1942 to 1945 was the story of the M1 Garand fighting across the most inhospitable terrain on Earth. At Tarawa in November 1943, Marines stormed a fortified coral atoll against a Japanese garrison that had prepared for exactly this kind of assault. The fighting was savage, the American casualties high. But the riflemen who made it off the beach and pushed inland were carrying M1s, and the close quarters fighting that followed. Bunker to bunker, trench to trench, was the environment where the semi-automatic's rate of fire made the difference between killing quickly and dying slowly. On Saipan in June 1944, the Japanese launched one of the largest banzai charges of the entire war. Over 3,000 soldiers, the final desperate attack of a garrison that knew it was finished. American Army soldiers and Marines with M1 Garands stopped the charge. The battlefield afterward was described by survivors as unlike anything they had ever seen. Hundreds of Japanese dead, stacked in front of positions that had held because the men behind them could fire fast enough. By late 1944, the pattern that had begun at Bataan in January 1942 had become the defining reality of the Pacific War. Japanese infantry, trained and brave and committed, was encountering an opponent whose individual rifleman was simply more lethal at medium and close range than anything their doctrine had been designed to handle. In the jungle, the M1's power also proved essential in a way that no one had fully anticipated. The dense undergrowth of the Pacific Islands, the vines, the trees, the undergrowth that could absorb small-caliber rounds, demanded penetrating power. The M1's 30-06 cartridge cut through that growth. Marines who had begun the war with M1 carbines started quietly swapping them for Garands taken from Army units. The rifle was heavier, it didn't matter. They wanted the power. An M1-equipped Marine rifle platoon in terms of sustained small arms fire was the equivalent of a company armed with bolt-action rifles. That is not an exaggeration. That is the math. And in the Pacific, math was destiny. Back in Japan, the engineers were trying to catch up. By 1944, Japan's situation in the Pacific had become desperate. American forces were closing on the home islands. The strategic calculus that had delayed semi-automatic rifle development was gone. The Japanese military finally committed to the one course of action that 3 years earlier might have mattered. They would copy the Garand. The project was given to the Imperial Japanese Navy rather than the Army. The Army had already abandoned earlier semi-automatic programs and was fully committed to the Arisaka. The Navy had more flexibility, more access to technical resources in the later war years, and more urgency. They set up manufacturing at the Yokosuka Naval Arsenal on Tokyo Bay. Their starting point was the captured M1 Garands from the Philippines. Japanese engineers disassembled, measured, and analyzed the weapon. They understood it. The challenge was adapting it to Japanese resources and the Japanese standard 7.7mm cartridge. The M1's N-block clip system, the 8-round package that loaded from above and ejected with that distinctive metallic sound when empty, created problems when rechambered for the Japanese 7,5 solidometer round. The dimensions were similar to the 30-06, similar enough that a captured M1 could actually fire Japanese ammunition, but the clip system wouldn't feed reliably. The Japanese engineers discarded it. Their solution was a fixed 10-round internal magazine loaded from above with 2 5-round Arisaka stripper clips. Externally, the rifle they developed, called the Type 4, though Western collectors often call it the Type 5, looked almost identical to the Garand. The profile, the stock, the gas-operated action were all clearly descended from John Garand's design. A collector today can stand a Type 4 next to an M1 and immediately see the family resemblance. It never made a difference. Only 250 Type 4 rifles were completed before Japan surrendered in August 1945. The jamming and feeding problems that had plagued earlier Japanese semi-automatic projects were never fully solved. The rifles that were assembled had reliability issues. Not one Type 4 rifle was documented in combat. The weapon that Japan had been trying to build since the 1930s, the semi-automatic service rifle that could match what American infantrymen carried, arrived 3 years too late, in quantities too small, with problems unsolved. Today, approximately 20 Type 4 rifles are known to exist in collections worldwide. The NRA's National Firearms Museum in Fairfax, Virginia, has one on display. They are extraordinary artifacts, the physical evidence of what it meant for an industrial nation to spend a decade chasing a problem that its enemy had already solved. There is a moment that historians of Pacific small arms come back to again and again because it crystallizes everything. Sometime in 1942, in the chaos and the carnage of the Bataan campaign, Japanese prisoners of war were interrogated about their experience under fire. They were experienced soldiers, veterans of China, men who had been in real combat. They were asked about the American infantry they had faced, and they asked in return how the Americans could afford to equip every single infantryman with a machine gun. They weren't being sarcastic. They weren't exaggerating. They genuinely did not understand what they had been fighting. Their intelligence had told them the Americans had the Springfield bolt action. What they had faced in the field was a rate of fire that didn't match any individual weapon in their frame of reference. They didn't know about the Garand. Their field manuals hadn't accounted for it. No one had told them. The Americans had, in fact, equipped every infantryman with what was, by the standards of 1942, a semi-miracle of industrial democracy. A weapon designed by a French-Canadian immigrant working for a government salary, produced by the tens of thousands by factory workers in Springfield and New Haven, carried by farm boys and city kids who had been in the Army for less than a year. It was not a machine gun. It was a rifle. It was the rifle. The legacy of the M1 Garand in the Pacific is written in the gap between what Japan expected and what Japan received. Japan went to war in the Pacific with a tactical doctrine built around the assumption that it would be fighting against bolt-action infantry. That assumption was wrong, not everywhere and not immediately, but at the critical points, in the critical battles again and again. The Battle of the Tenaru, Makin Island, Henderson Field, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Wherever the Japanese launched the massed assault that had worked in China, they ran into American riflemen who could fire so fast that the assault couldn't survive the crossing. The M1 did not win the Pacific War alone. No single weapon wins a war. What it did was change the terms of the infantry engagement in the Pacific theater in a way that the Japanese military recognized, tried to adapt to, and never fully solved. General George Patton, a man constitutionally incapable of excessive praise, called the M1 the greatest battle implement ever devised. He said that in January 1945, by which point he had seen the rifle perform in North Africa, Sicily, Italy, Normandy, and across France and Germany. He was right. He was not given to being wrong about weapons. John Garand himself received his gold medal for meritorious service in 1941. He kept working at Springfield Armory until he retired in 1953. He never got the $100,000 congressional grant that was proposed in his honor. He helped design the M14 that eventually replaced his M1. He died in 1974 at the age of 86 at his home in Springfield, Massachusetts, largely unknown to the general public. The rifle he designed without taking a cent in royalties is still, 80 years later, considered one of the finest battle rifles ever made. Competitive shooters still use it. Veterans who carried it still talk about it with something that goes beyond fondness. Something closer to trust. The kind of trust you have for the thing that kept you alive. When the Japanese prisoners in 1942 asked how the Americans could equip every man with a machine gun, they were witnessing something they had no cultural or doctrinal framework for. A democratic industrial power that had decided its individual soldier, every individual soldier, not just the specialists, not just the elite, deserved the best possible rifle that technology could produce. That decision was made before the war started. It was made by an Army Ordnance Board in 1936 and ratified by every factory worker who pulled a night shift in Springfield and New Haven. It was embodied in a 9.5-pound rifle that went into foxholes in the Philippines and came out firing. The Japanese soldier who faced that rifle in the dark jungle of Bataan, who heard the roar of the guns and couldn't understand what he was hearing, was facing something that went beyond the sum of its parts. He was facing what America could build when it decided to build it. There were a lot of weapons in that war. There was only one Garand. If this story meant something to you, if you believe that history like this deserves to be told and remembered, please subscribe to this channel and share this video with someone who cares about where we came from and what it cost. Hit the like button. Leave a comment below. Tell us which battle in the Pacific you think best demonstrated the M1 Garand's impact. And if you haven't activated the bell notification, do it now. We have more stories coming, and you won't want to miss them. This was the story of what happened when Japanese soldiers first faced the M1 Garand. The answer in the end is simple. They never stopped facing it.